Imagine a place that held the sum of all human knowledge. A place where the plays of Sophocles, all 120 of them, sat on shelves next to histories of Babylon written by a Babylonian priest. Imagine scrolls detailing the engineering of Archimedes, the geometry of Euclid, and a catalog of every star in the sky. Now imagine it gone. The lost Library of Alexandria isn't just a story about a burned building. It's a ghost that haunts our history. It's a symbol of all the knowledge we've lost. But what if the story you know is wrong? What if it wasn't one building? What if a single fire didn't destroy it? And what if the real story is more complex and maybe even more tragic than the simple myth we're all told? Number 15 was the library, even a single building. Most people picture one giant building, a sort of ancient Greek Parthenon, but stuffed with scrolls. The grand facade, the columns, the steps, leading up to a place of silent, sacred learning. This image is powerful. It's also completely wrong. The Library of Alexandria was never just one building. It was part of a much larger, more ambitious institution. Think of it less like a public library and more like a modern university campus, combined with a top-tier research institute. This whole project was called the Mouseion. In Greek, that means Shrine of the Muses, the goddesses of the arts and sciences. It was founded in the early 3rd century BCE by Ptolemy Isoter, a general who served under Alexander the Great. When Alexander died, Ptolemy took control of Egypt and wanted to make his new capital, Alexandria, the intellectual center of the world. The Mouseion was his tool to achieve that. The writer Strabo, a Greek geographer and historian, actually visited Alexandria around 20 BCE. He walked through the Mouseion and described it for us. He doesn't describe one library building. He describes a whole complex. He mentions a covered walkway, a large hall where scholars ate their meals together, and rooms for study and lectures. It was a place where people lived and worked. The Ptolemies paid for everything. The scholars who were invited to the Mouseion, and you had to be the best of the best, received a salary, free meals, lodging, and they didn't have to pay taxes. Their only job was to think, to research, to write, and to argue. So where were the books? The main collection, the Bibliotheca, was part of this Mouseion complex. It was the heart of the Research Institute, the tool that allowed these great minds to work. But it wasn't the only collection of books. There was another later library established as an offshoot or a daughter library. This was located in a completely different part of the city, in the temple complex dedicated to the god Serapis, called the Serapeum. This library was likely more accessible to the public, a place where people who weren't official scholars of the Mouseion could go to read. This changes everything about how we think of the library's destruction. The famous story of a single, catastrophic fire becomes much less likely. You can't destroy a sprawling campus with multiple book collections in different locations with one fire. It suggests a different kind of tragedy, not a sudden death, but a slow decay, a death by 1,000 cuts. Different parts of the institution could have been damaged or neglected at different times. The main collection at the Mouseion might have suffered one fate, while the scrolls at the Serapeum suffered another, decades or even centuries later. The very idea of a single building is a modern simplification. We like our stories neat and tidy. The reality of the Mouseion was a messy, sprawling, living place. It was a community. The buildings were just the shell. The real institution was the collection of minds working there, funded by kings who wanted to own all the knowledge in the world. Realizing it was a campus, not a single structure, is the first step to understanding what was truly lost and how it was lost. It wasn't just a pile of scrolls that vanished, it was an entire ecosystem of knowledge. What we still don't know is haunting. What did the floor plan of the Mouseion actually look like? Strabo gives us a sketch, but archaeological evidence is buried under the modern city of Alexandria. How were the different research departments organized within the complex? Were there separate wings for astronomy, medicine, and literature? Between the main library and the daughter library at the Serapeum. Were they collaborators or were they rivals for resources and prestige? Was one a backup of the other, or did they hold unique collections? The physical reality of the greatest center of learning in the ancient world is still largely a mystery. That's number 14. Was it just a place to store books? The word library makes us think of a quiet place. Rows of shelves, people reading, librarians stamping books. That wasn't the Library of Alexandria. It was a factory of knowledge, not just a warehouse. The goal wasn't simply to collect scrolls, the goal was to use them to create new knowledge. It was the world's first true think tank. The scholars of the Mouseion weren't just reading. They were editing, correcting, and standardizing the great texts of the past. Think about the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad, and the Odyssey. Before Alexandria, there were countless different versions, floating around the Greek world. Scribes made errors. Performers added their own lines. The poems were a mess. Scholars at the Mouseion, like Zenodotus and Aristarchus of Samothrace, took on the monumental task of creating a standard critical edition. They compared different versions of the scrolls, they debated which lines were authentic, they invented punctuation and a system of critical symbols to mark questionable passages. The version of Homer we read today is a direct descendant of the work done by these men in Alexandria. They weren't just librarians, they were editors, literary critics, and textual detectives. But it went far beyond literature. Science and mathematics flourished at the Mouseion. For Euclid, the father of geometry, worked there. He wrote Elements, a textbook that was used for over 2,000 years. It's arguably the most successful textbook in the history of the world. It wasn't just a summary of what was already known. Euclid organized geometric knowledge into a single logical system, starting from simple definitions and moving to complex proofs. This logical structure became the model for scientific reasoning for centuries. Then there was Eratosthenes. He was the head librarian for a time, but he was also an astronomer, a geographer, and a mathematician. He did something incredible. While in Alexandria, he figured out the circumference of the Earth. He knew that on the summer solstice, the sun was directly overhead in a city to the south called Syene, modern Aswan. At the same time in Alexandria, he measured the angle of the sun's shadow. Using the distance between the two cities and some simple geometry, he calculated the Earth's circumference. His result was astonishingly accurate, off by only a small percentage. This wasn't an accident. It was the result of a scientific environment that gave him access to records, measurements, and the freedom to think. Archimedes, the legendary inventor and mathematician, studied in Alexandria and corresponded with the scholars there. The great anatomist Herophilus worked there, performing the first systematic dissections of human bodies. He distinguished between the brain and the mind, identified nerves, and described the circulatory system. His work was foundational for medicine, but it was so advanced and controversial that it wasn't surpassed for over a millennium. This kind of work, dissecting human bodies, was taboo in most of the ancient world. But the Ptolemies encouraged it. They wanted results. The library was the engine for this innovation. It provided the data, the scrolls from across the known world. The Mouseion provided the structure, the salaries, the community of scholars, the lecture halls. This combination created a super collider for ideas. People weren't there just to passively read old texts. They were there to build upon them, to argue with them, and to create something entirely new. It was a loud, argumentative, and incredibly productive place. The quiet, dusty library of our imagination doesn't even come close to the reality. Yet, deep questions remain. How much collaboration was there between departments? Did the mathematicians regularly talk to the poets? Did the astronomers share findings with the geographers? Or were they isolated in their own fields? We know they created great things, but we don't know how the social and intellectual dynamics of the Mouseion actually worked. Was there a peer review process for new works created there? And perhaps most importantly, how much of their work was truly original versus being syntheses of older, now lost Babylonian and Egyptian knowledge that they had access to for the first time? Number 13. Who paid for all this and why? Knowledge is never free. The Library of Alexandria was an incredibly expensive project. The cost of acquiring, copying, and storing hundreds of thousands of scrolls was immense. The cost of supporting 100 or more of the world's top intellectuals, giving them salaries, food, and tax-free living for their entire lives was astronomical. So who footed the bill? The answer is the Ptolemies, the dynasty of Greek kings who ruled Egypt after Alexander the Great. And their motives weren't purely about the love of learning. It was about power, prestige, and propaganda. The founder of the dynasty, Ptolemy Isoter, was a savvy general. He understood that military might wasn't enough to secure his new kingdom. He was a Greek ruling over an ancient Egyptian civilization. He needed to establish his legitimacy. He also needed to make his capital, Alexandria, the most important city in the Hellenistic world, surpassing rivals in Athens and Pergamon. The library was a statement. It was a way of saying, all knowledge lives here. We are the center of the world. This was a form of soft power by collecting the texts of every culture. Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, Jewish, the Ptolemies were claiming ownership of their wisdom. It was an act of intellectual imperialism. They weren't just gathering scrolls, they were gathering the world's cultural heritage and concentrating it in their city under their control. When scholars from across the Mediterranean had to travel to Alexandria to consult the definitive text of Homer or a rare work of science, it reinforced the city's and the dynasty's importance. There was also a practical side. The Ptolemies needed skilled engineers to build their infrastructure, doctors to keep them healthy, and astronomers to manage the calendar, which was crucial for an agricultural society like Egypt. The research at the Mouseion wasn't just abstract, it produced results. The engineering of people like Archimedes and Ctesibius led to new siege engines, water pumps, and automated devices. The medical knowledge made Alexandrian doctors the best in the world. This had direct military and economic benefits. The rivalry with other kingdoms fueled the obsession with collecting. The kings of Pergamon, in modern-day Turkey, built their own great library. The Ptolemies and the Attalids of Pergamon entered into a kind of literary arms race. They competed to acquire the rarest texts and attract the most famous scholars. According to one story, this rivalry got so intense that Ptolemy V banned the export of papyrus from Egypt, trying to cripple Pergamon's ability to produce new books. In response, the Pergamene supposedly invented parchment made from animal skins as a substitute. This story, whether literally true or not, shows the level of competition. This wasn't a gentle academic pursuit, it was a high-stakes cultural war. So while the scholars themselves were likely driven by curiosity and a genuine desire for knowledge, the royal patronage that made it all possible was rooted in politics. The library was a tool of statecraft. It was a symbol of wealth, a beacon to attract talent, a factory for useful innovations, and a weapon in a cultural war for dominance. The pursuit of universal knowledge was underwritten by the very worldly pursuit of power. This leaves us with some unsettling questions. How much control did the Ptolemies exert over the research? Did scholars ever face censorship or pressure to produce work that glorified the ruling dynasty? The poet Sotades was supposedly executed by being sealed in a lead chest and thrown into the sea for writing rude verses about Ptolemy II's marriage. How free was the speech at the Mouseion really? And did the focus on Greek knowledge, despite the collection of other texts, end up devaluing or erasing local Egyptian intellectual traditions? Was the library a bridge between cultures or a monument to the dominance of one over another? Number 12. How did they get all those books? A library is nothing without its collection. The ambition of the Ptolemies was breathtaking to collect a copy of every book in the world. But how do you do that in an age before printing presses and the internet? You do it with immense wealth and ruthless determination. The acquisition policy of the Library of Alexandria was legendary for its aggression. One of the most famous stories concerns what is known as the ship shakedown. Alexandria was a major port, a hub of trade and travel on the Mediterranean. Under a royal decree, every ship that docked in the harbor was to be searched. Not for contraband, but for books. Any scrolls found on board were seized and taken to the library. There, a team of scribes would make a high-quality copy. The copy was then given back to the owner of the original scroll. The original scroll, the authentic older version, was kept by the library and placed in its collection, labeled from the ships. It was a brilliant, if ethically questionable, way to build a collection. Imagine arriving in a new country and having customs seize your books, only to return a photocopy to you weeks later. They also pursued books through more conventional means. Royal agents were dispatched all over the Mediterranean world with massive budgets. Their job was to buy any book they could find at any price. They traveled to the great book markets of Athens and Rhodes, hunting for old scrolls, collections of plays, philosophical treatises, and histories. The competition was fierce, especially with the rival library at Pergamon, which drove prices sky high. There's a famous story told by the writer Galen about a scheme involving Athens. The Ptolemies wanted the official state copies of the plays of the great tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These were master copies held in the Athenian archives. Athens didn't want to let them go. But Ptolemy III made them an offer. He would borrow the scrolls to have them copied, and he would leave a huge amount of silver 15 talents, an enormous sum as a security deposit. The Athenians agreed that Ptolemy had the plays copied onto the finest quality papyrus. Then he sent the beautiful new copies back to Athens and kept the original priceless scrolls for the library's collection. He told the Athenians they could keep the deposit. He essentially bought the originals with a trick, leaving the deposit as payment. They also acquired knowledge through translation. Ptolemy II Philadelphus commissioned one of the most significant translation projects in history. He wanted the Jewish Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, translated into Greek for the library. The story, likely embellished, says he gathered 72 Jewish scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. They were brought to Alexandria, and in 72 days, they produced 72 identical translations. This translation became known as the Septuagint, from the Latin for 70. It was a landmark event. It made the Hebrew scriptures accessible to the entire Greek-speaking world and was the version of the Old Testament used by most early Christians. It shows that the library's ambition wasn't just limited to Greek texts. They actively sought out and integrated the knowledge of other cultures. This relentless drive to acquire everything defined the library. It was a vacuum cleaner for the world's knowledge. But this aggression came at a cost, creating resentment and raising questions about ownership and authenticity that still echo today. What we are left wondering is this: how many scrolls were acquired through these forceful from the ship's confiscations? Was this a daily occurrence or a rare one? How many owners simply never got their books back, even the copies? We also don't know the full scope of the acquisition agents' work. Did they travel beyond the Mediterranean, perhaps into Persia or even India, in search of texts? And how many forgeries were created to sell to the library's eager agents, who had deep pockets and a royal mandate to buy, buy, buy? The very hunger for books might have created a thriving market for fakes. Number 11. How did they organize 500,000 scrolls? Having a huge collection of books is one thing. Being able to find anything in it is another. Imagine a warehouse with 400,000 or 500,000 unmarked scrolls. It would be completely useless. The true genius of the Library of Alexandria wasn't just in its collection, but in its organization. It was here that the very concept of a library catalog was invented, a monumental achievement that shaped how we've organized information ever since. The man credited with this Herculean task was a scholar named Callimachus of Cyrene. He was a poet and a critic who worked at the library in the 3rd century BCE. He never became head librarian, but his contribution was arguably more important than any of theirs. He created a work called the Pinakes, which translates to tables or lists. The Pinakes was nothing less than the first library catalog in history, and it was so much more than a simple list of titles. It was a systematic, critical, and biographical survey of all of Greek literature. The full title was Tables of Persons Eminent in Every Branch of Learning and Their Writings. It filled 120 scrolls. That's right, the catalog itself was a massive, multi-volume work. It was a bibliography of the entire collection. Callimachus didn't just list scrolls alphabetically by title. That would have been difficult, as many scrolls didn't have a formal title on the outside. Instead, he organized the entire collection by subject. He divided all of knowledge into broad categories: rhetoric, law, epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, history, medicine, mathematics, and natural science. Within these categories, he listed the authors alphabetically. For each author, the Pinakes provided a short biography. This was crucial. It helped distinguish between authors with the same name and provided context for their work. Then, under the author's name, he listed their known writings. For each work, he would record the first line of the text. This was the ancient world's equivalent of an ISBN number. It served as a unique identifier, helping scholars make sure they had the correct text and not a corrupted or different version. Callimachus also included information about the authenticity of the work. He would note if a text was considered genuine or if its authorship was debated or known to be fake. Sometimes he would even include a note on the number of lines in the scroll. This was a revolution. Before the Pinakes, finding a specific text in a large collection was a matter of memory or luck. Callimachus applied logic and a systematic approach. He wasn't just cataloging, he was creating a map of the entire landscape of Greek knowledge. He was defining the canon. By deciding which category a work belonged to and which author wrote it, he was making critical judgments that would influence scholarship for generations. His system allowed a reader to not only find a specific scroll, but also to see everything written by a particular author, or everything written on a particular subject. The Pinakes itself is lost. We only know about it through references in later works. but its impact is immeasurable. Every library catalog, every bibliography, every further reading list at the end of a chapter owes a debt to Callimachus. He faced a problem of information overload, a challenge we are all too familiar with today, and he solved it. He turned a chaotic pile of scrolls into an ordered, accessible universe of knowledge. He created the tools needed to navigate the sea of information the Ptolemies had collected. The loss of the Pinakes leaves a void. What were all the major subject categories Callimachus used? Did he have a miscellaneous section for works that defied classification? How did he handle anonymous texts or works with multiple authors? More importantly, what did his biographical notes say about figures like Plato or Aristotle? Did they contain information sourced from now lost texts that would completely change our understanding of these famous thinkers? The catalog of the Lost Library is itself one of the most painful losses of all. Number 10. What kind of geniuses actually worked there? The Mouseion was a magnet for talent. For centuries, if you were the smartest person in your field in the Hellenistic world, Alexandria was where you wanted to be. The promise of a stable salary, intellectual freedom, and access to the greatest collection of knowledge ever assembled was an irresistible draw. The list of scholars who worked there reads like a who's who of the ancient intellectual world. We've already mentioned some of them. Euclid, whose elements defined the study of geometry, and Eratosthenes, who measured the earth, created a sophisticated map of the world, and developed a system for calculating prime numbers. Callimachus, the poet-scholar who cataloged the entire library. These figures alone would be enough to secure the library's place in history. But there were so many more. In the field of astronomy, Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system. He argued that the Earth revolved around the Sun nearly 1,800 years before Copernicus. His original work is lost, but we know about it because others, like Archimedes, discussed it. And his theory was largely rejected in favor of the geocentric model of Claudius Ptolemy, a later Alexandrian scholar, not one of the kings, which held sway until the Renaissance. Imagine how history might have changed if Aristarchus's model had been accepted. Another giant of astronomy was Hipparchus. Working in the 2nd century BCE, he is often considered the greatest observational astronomer of antiquity. He created the first comprehensive star catalog, listing over 850 stars and documenting their brightness. He calculated the length of the year to within 6.5 minutes of the correct value. And by comparing his own observations with older Babylonian records, he discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. This was a discovery of fundamental importance. In engineering and mechanics, the minds were just as brilliant. Ctesibius of Alexandria, working in the 3rd century BCE, was a pioneer in the study of compressed air and hydraulics. He invented the water organ, the hydraulis, a sophisticated musical instrument, and developed a more accurate water clock, a clepsydra. His work laid the foundations for the field of pneumatics. A later engineer hero of Alexandria, or Heron, created all sorts of seemingly magical devices. He described the world's first steam engine, the Aeolipile. He built automated temple doors that opened with fire, vending machines that dispensed holy water when a coin was inserted, and even a programmable cart. While many of these were treated as curiosities or toys, they demonstrated an understanding of mechanics and automation far ahead of its time. Medicine also saw incredible advances. Herophilus and Erasistratus, working in the early days of the Mouseion, were pioneers of anatomy. They conducted dissections and possibly even vivisections of condemned criminals, which gave them unprecedented insight into the workings of the human body. They described the nervous system, distinguishing between sensory and motor nerves. They understood the role of the heart as a pump and described its valves. Their detailed anatomical knowledge was not surpassed until the work of Vesalius in the 16th century. These weren't just isolated geniuses. They were part of a community. They read each other's work, argued, collaborated, and competed. The geographers used the findings of the astronomers. The engineers used the principles of the mathematicians. The doctors applied a scientific, observational method honed in other fields. The Mouseion created an environment where this cross-pollination of ideas could happen. It was a critical mass of intelligence, and the result was an explosion of discovery. But this raises some profound questions. Why did Aristarchus' heliocentric model fail to catch on? Was it simply too radical, or was there a scientific debate using evidence we no longer have? How did figures like Hero power their devices? Did they have access to manufacturing techniques or fuel sources we are unaware of? And what about the ethical debates? Was there public outcry over the human dissections performed by Herophilus? The story of the great minds of Alexandria is not just one of triumph, but also of dead ends, lost arguments, and forgotten controversies. Number 9, did it really hold all the world's knowledge? The stated ambition was to collect a copy of every book in the world. This is a powerful, romantic idea. It suggests a single institution that held the complete record of human thought. But was this goal ever actually achieved? The answer is almost certainly no. But the attempt itself was what made the library so extraordinary. First, we have to consider the known world from the perspective of a Greek scholar in Alexandria. Their world was the Mediterranean basin, Persia, and the lands conquered by Alexander the Great. While they had some knowledge of India, and perhaps vague rumors of lands further east, their conception of the world was limited. The vast literary traditions of China, the complex philosophies of India, and the oral histories of Africa and the Americas were completely outside their scope. So, from a modern global perspective, it was never a world library. Even within their own known world, the task was impossible. Many books would have existed in single copies in private collections, never to be found by the Ptolemies agents. And countless texts from other cultures, written in languages the Greek scholars couldn't read, would have been ignored. While the translation of the Hebrew Septuagint was a major exception, it's unlikely that similar large-scale projects were undertaken for other languages. We know the library had some Egyptian texts, and Berossus, a Babylonian priest, wrote a history of his people in Greek for the collection. But these seem to be isolated cases. The overwhelming focus was on Greek literature, philosophy, and science. So, the library was not a multicultural repository in the modern sense. It was primarily a comprehensive collection of Hellenic knowledge, with some curated editions from other cultures that were considered significant or useful to the Greek-speaking scholars. It was a monument to Greek intellectual achievement, as much as a library of the world. However, within the world of Greek writing, its comprehensiveness was legendary. The goal was to have not just one copy of Homer, but every significant regional variant. They wanted all 120 plays of Sophocles, not just the 7 that survive today. They wanted the complete works of the pre-Socratic philosophers, whose ideas we only know from fragments quoted by later authors. But they aimed for a complete collection. The scholar Luciano Canfora, in his book The Vanished Library, argues that the true universality of the library was its method. It was the first institution to systematically collect, classify, and edit texts on an industrial scale. The ambition was universal, even if the execution was limited by the practicalities of the ancient world. They established the very idea that all knowledge could and should be gathered in one place. This was a radical departure from the scattered private collections that came before it. The library's claim to universality, then, was more of a mission statement than a reality. It was a powerful piece of propaganda for the Ptolemies and a guiding principle for the scholars. The very belief that they were building a complete repository of knowledge likely drove them to be more thorough and more aggressive in their collecting than they otherwise would have been. It was an impossible goal, but in striving for it, they assembled the greatest collection of texts the world had ever seen. This leaves us with fascinating unknowns. What non-Greek works did they actually have? We hear about the Septuagint and Berossus, but were there others? Did they have translations of Persian Zoroastrian texts or Indian philosophical works that have since been lost? How did the Greek librarians classify these foreign texts? Did they lump them together as barbarian literature, or did they attempt to integrate them into their existing subject categories? And ultimately, did the library's strong focus on collecting and standardizing the Greek canon inadvertently lead to the neglect and eventual loss of works from other traditions? Number 8. How many scrolls were actually there? The numbers are staggering. Ancient sources throw out figures that are hard to comprehend. One of the earliest accounts, from a writer named Aulus Gellius, claims that at its peak, the royal library held 700,000 scrolls. The writer Ammianus Marcellinus echoes this number. Other sources give slightly different figures. John Tzetzes, a 12th century Byzantine scholar, claimed the main library held 400,000 mixed scrolls and 90,000 unmixed single-text scrolls, while the daughter library at the Serapeum held 42,800. The numbers most often cited are somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000, but what do these numbers actually mean? It's tempting to think of 400,000 scrolls as 400,000 unique books like in a modern library, but that's not how it worked. A single book or work, like Homer's Iliad, would have been far too long to fit on one papyrus scroll. The Iliad would have been divided into 24 scrolls, one for each of its 24 books. So a single work of literature could be made up of dozens of individual scrolls. Furthermore, the library's policy was to collect multiple copies and different versions of the same work. They might have had 10 or 20 different versions of the Iliad collected from different cities, each one made up of 24 scrolls. So one work could account for hundreds of physical scrolls in the collection. This is what Tetzes likely meant by mixed and unmixed scrolls. Some scrolls contain multiple shorter works, while others were part of a single larger work. So the raw number of scrolls is misleading. Modern scholars have tried to estimate how many unique works this might represent. The classicist Lionel Casson estimated that if the library held 400,000 scrolls, this might translate to roughly 30,000 to 50,000 unique titles or works. That's still an incredible number, far larger than any other collection in the ancient world, but it's a more realistic figure than 500,000 unique books. Even these adjusted numbers are debated. Some scholars, like the historian Roy MacLeod, are skeptical of the high figures given by ancient sources, viewing them as exaggerations meant to glorify the library. It's possible the real numbers were much lower. Unfortunately, we have no surviving inventory, no part of the Penekes to give us a definitive answer. The archaeology of Alexandria is also difficult. The ancient royal quarter is underwater or built over, so we haven't found the foundations of the library buildings to estimate their physical capacity. What we do know is that the collection was vast enough to require an entirely new system of organization, Callimachus's Pinakes, and to support a community of researchers for centuries. Whether the exact number was 200,000 or 700,000, it was an unprecedented concentration of written material. It was large enough to contain not just the well-known classics, but thousands of works by authors whose names are now completely forgotten. It was a library not just of masterpieces, but of the entire literary and scientific output of a civilization. The sheer scale is what makes its loss so painful. We didn't just lose a few books, we lost a nearly complete data set of the ancient Greek mind. The numbers, whether exaggerated or not, represent a critical mass of information. The loss wasn't just of individual data points, but of the network of connections between them. The uncertainty about the numbers leads to some fundamental questions. Were the ancient figures a genuine attempt at a census of the scrolls, or were they just rhetorical flourishes, the ancient equivalent of marketing hype? How did the collection size fluctuate over time? Did it grow continuously, or were there periods of decline and purges of old material even before the final destruction? And if the lower estimates are correct, does that mean the library's influence has been overstated? Or does it show that even a smaller but well-curated and actively used collection can change the world? We're number 7. So, did Caesar really burn it down? This is the most famous story. The image of Julius Caesar, the great Roman general, callously setting fire to the world's greatest library, is burned into our collective memory. It's a simple, dramatic story of military recklessness destroying culture. It's also a story that is, at best, a misunderstanding, and at worst, a complete myth. Here's what we know. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar was in Alexandria, embroiled in a civil war against his rival Pompey. After defeating Pompey, Caesar got involved in an Egyptian power struggle, siding with Cleopatra against her brother Ptolemy XIII. The Egyptian forces besieged Caesar in the royal palace and tried to block his access to the harbor. In the ensuing battle, Caesar's men set fire to the Egyptian fleet to prevent it from being used against them. The ancient sources that describe this event are where the confusion starts. The Roman philosopher Seneca, writing about a century later, mentions that 40,000 scrolls were burned in this fire. Plutarch, a Greek historian, also describes the fire spreading from the docks and burning the great library. On the surface, this seems conclusive, but other contemporary sources are silent. Caesar himself wrote a detailed account of the Alexandrian War, and he never mentions burning the library. If he had accidentally destroyed the most famous cultural institution in the world, it's something he probably would have tried to explain or justify. His silence is suspicious. The geographer Strabo, who we mentioned earlier, was working in Alexandria just a few decades after Caesar. He describes the Mouseion and makes no mention of it having been destroyed. He talks about it as a functioning institution, so how do we square this circle? The most likely explanation is that the fire Caesar set at the docks did spread to some nearby warehouses. These warehouses may have contained scrolls, but these scrolls were probably not part of the main library collection itself. They could have been scrolls waiting to be processed into the library, or scrolls being prepared for export in the book trade. Seneca's 40,000 scrolls could have been in these warehouses, not in the main building of the Mouseion, which was located in a different part of the royal quarter, away from the docks. So Caesar likely did burn a significant number of scrolls, but he almost certainly did not burn down the great library itself. The institution continued to exist and function for centuries after his visit. Those scholars were still working at the Mouseion, and references to the library continued to appear in Roman times. The story of Caesar burning the library became popular much later. It was a useful story for his political enemies, a way to paint him as a barbarian. And for later Christians, blaming the pagan Caesar was a convenient way to deflect from the eventual destruction of the Serapeum library by Christian mobs. The story is simple, has a famous villain, and explains a great tragedy in a single, dramatic event. The reality that the library likely suffered multiple misfortunes over a long period of time is messier and less satisfying. The myth of Caesar's fire is a classic example of how a complex historical event gets flattened into a simple, memorable, but inaccurate story. This still leaves us with crucial questions. What exactly was in those warehouses by the docks? Were they priceless originals from the ships waiting to be cataloged, or were they just copies for sale? If Strabo saw the Mouseion as a functioning institution, had the collection been severely depleted by the fire, or was the loss a minor one in the grand scheme of things? And why did later writers like Plutarch and Seneca so confidently blame Caesar for burning the library itself? Were they misinformed, or were they deliberately shaping the narrative for their own purposes? The ghost of Caesar's fire still clouds our understanding of the library's long decline. Number 6. If not Caesar, then who? The slow death of a library. If Caesar didn't deliver the killing blow, then what happened to the library? The truth is, there was no single cause. The library didn't die in a blaze of glory. It faded away. Its decline was a slow, painful process that lasted for centuries, a story of budget cuts, political purges, civil strife, and shifting cultural values. The problem started with the patrons. The later Ptolemaic dynasty was not as stable or as intellectually inclined as the early ones. Political instability and civil war rocked Alexandria. In 145 BCE, Ptolemy VIII, a particularly brutal ruler, purged Alexandria of intellectuals who had supported his rivals. Many scholars of the Mouseion were either killed or exiled. The head librarian, Aristarchus of Samothrace, the great editor of Homer, was among those who fled. This was a major blow. An institution is only as good as the people who worked there. Driving out the top minds began the brain drain, then came the Romans. After Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. The emperors continued to fund the Mouseion, but it seems the old spirit of independent inquiry began to wane. The focus may have shifted from groundbreaking original research to more conservative scholarship, like writing commentaries on the classics. The financial support from Rome was also likely less generous and less consistent than it had been under the Ptolemies. An institution that runs on state funding is always vulnerable to the state's changing priorities. The physical city of Alexandria also suffered. It was the site of several major conflicts. In the 3rd century CE, the Roman Emperor Aurelian, while suppressing a rebellion, destroyed the Mouseion, the royal quarter of the city where the main Mouseion and library were located. Contemporary accounts describe this area as being devastated. This was likely a mortal blow to the original main collection. If any part of it had survived until then, it probably didn't survive this conflict. This event, far more than Caesar's fire, was probably the end of the line for the royal library. But it gets very little attention because Aurelian is not as famous as Caesar. Even after this, the daughter library at the Serapeum still existed. It was a major intellectual center in its own right, holding tens of thousands of scrolls. But the world was changing. The rise of Christianity created a new cultural and intellectual landscape. The old pagan learning, represented by the scrolls in the Serapeum, was increasingly seen as irrelevant or even dangerous by some zealous Christians. The final, decisive act came in 391 CE. Theophilus, the bishop of Alexandria, was a militant and politically powerful Christian. He received permission from the Emperor Theodosius I, who was systematically stamping out paganism across the empire to destroy the Serapeum. It wasn't about the books specifically, it was about destroying a powerful pagan temple. but the library was part of the temple complex. A mob of Christians, led by Theophilus, stormed the Serapeum and laid it to waste. Any scrolls that remained in its collection were likely destroyed or dispersed in this attack. This was the end of the last major remnant of the Great Library. Finally, in 642 CE, the Arabs conquered Alexandria. There's a much later, and almost certainly fictional, story that the Caliph Omar was asked what to do with the remaining books. He supposedly said, if these books agree with the Quran, they are redundant. If they disagree, they are heretical. Destroy them. The story says the scrolls were used to heat the city's bathhouses for 6 months. It's a dramatic tale, but it's not found in any early sources and contradicts the known Muslim respect for science and learning. Most historians dismiss it as a fabrication. By the time the Arabs arrived, there was likely no great library left to burn. So there is no single culprit. The library was a victim of political purges, war, neglect, and finally, the rising tide of religious intolerance. It died a slow death, piece by piece, over the course of 400 years. The unanswered questions are about the details of this decline. How many scrolls were lost during the purge of Ptolemy VIII? What was the exact state of the main library's collection when Aurelian's forces destroyed the royal quarter? Was anything salvaged? And in the final attack on the Serapeum in 391 CE, was the mob's primary goal to destroy the pagan idols, with the scrolls being collateral damage? Or were the books themselves a target of their fury? We know the big events, but the human-level story of what happened to the last librarians and the last scrolls is lost to us. Number 5. What about the daughter library? The forgotten heart of the collection. When people talk about the Library of Alexandria, they usually mean the main royal library, part of the Mouseion. But for a significant part of its history, especially in its later years, the intellectual heart of the city may have been the daughter library in the Temple of Serapis, the Serapeum. This second library is often treated as a footnote, but its story is crucial to understanding the whole picture. The Serapeum was built by Ptolemy III in the 3rd century BCE, sometime after the main library was established. It was located in a different part of the city, in the Egyptian quarter of Rakotis, on a small hill or acropolis. This location was significant. While the main Mouseion was in the royal Greek quarter, the Serapeum was in a more public, mixed-race part of town. It was part of a grand temple complex dedicated to Serapis, a hybrid Greco-Egyptian god created by the Ptolemies to unify their Greek and Egyptian subjects. The library? There was likely more accessible to the general public than the elite, research-focused royal library. Its collection was huge. John Setzes gives the figure of 42,800 scrolls. While much smaller than the main library's collection, this would still have made it one of the largest libraries in the ancient world. Some scholars believe the Serapeum housed the overflow copies from the main collection or the copies that were returned to the ship owners. Others think it housed a curated collection of best works for a wider audience. It's possible it had its own acquisition policy and held unique scrolls not found in the main library. For centuries, the two libraries coexisted, but as the main library in the Brutian quarter declined due to neglect and war, the Serapeum's importance grew. After the destruction of the royal quarter by Aurelian in 273 CE, the Serapeum was likely the only major library left in Alexandria. It became the inheritor of the great tradition. For over a century, it was the Library of Alexandria. The great pagan scholars of the 4th century, like the philosopher Hypatia, would have worked with the collection at the Serapeum. This is what makes its destruction in 391 CE so tragic. It wasn't the destruction of a pagan temple, it was the final, definitive end of the great library tradition in Alexandria. We have an eyewitness account from the Christian historian Rufinus. He describes how Bishop Theophilus and his followers went on a rampage smashing pagan idols. He mentions the destruction of the building, but frustratingly, he doesn't mention what happened to the scrolls. Were they burned on the spot? Were they carried away and hidden by pagan scholars? Were some of them simply left to rot in the ruined building? The destruction of the Serapeum was a symbolic act. It was a victory of a new Christian worldview over the old pagan intellectual tradition. The knowledge in those scrolls, pagan philosophy, science, literature, was seen by Theophilus as a threat to Christian faith. The destruction wasn't an accident of war, like Caesar's fire. It was a deliberate act of cultural erasure. The focus on the main library and the myth of Caesar's fire have obscured the central role of the Serapeum. For the last 100 plus years of its existence, the spirit of the Library of Alexandria lived on a hill in the Egyptian quarter. Its end was not quiet neglect, but a loud, violent, and ideologically motivated demolition. The loss of records from the Serapeum leaves us with deep uncertainties. What was the exact nature of its collection? Was it just a duplicate of the main library, or did it hold unique treasures? We know Hypatia taught there, but who else? What discoveries were made using the Serapeum's collection in those later Roman centuries? And what was the immediate aftermath of its destruction? Did a black market for the surviving scrolls emerge in the city? Did scholars make heroic, last-ditch efforts to save texts from the mob? The final chapter of the library's life is one of its most obscure. Number 4. What specific knowledge did we actually lose? This is the question that haunts us. It's not just about losing scrolls, it's about losing the ideas they contained. While we can never know for sure, we can make some educated guesses based on references and surviving works. The picture that emerges is devastating. We lost not just details, but entire branches of knowledge. In literature, the losses are staggering. We have 7 surviving plays by Sophocles, one of the 3 great Athenian tragedians. We know he wrote over 120. The library would have had all of them. We have a similar number from Aeschylus, who wrote around 90. And Euripides was more fortunate. We have 19 of his 90-plus plays. The library would have had the complete works of all 3, plus the works of countless other playwrights whose names are now just footnotes. We have lost hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Greek plays, including entire genres we know little about. In history, the loss is just as profound. A Babylonian priest named Berossus wrote a 3-volume history of Babylonia in Greek, specifically for the library. It contained the history and mythology of Mesopotamia, stretching back to creation. It is now lost, and we only have fragmented quotes from it. This would be our single best source for understanding ancient Babylonian civilization from an insider's perspective. Similarly, an Egyptian priest named Manetho wrote a history of Egypt. His work is also lost, but the king list he created is the foundation for all modern Egyptology. Imagine having his full narrative. We lost countless other histories of the ancient world, records of civilizations and events that are now blank spaces on our historical map. Science is perhaps the most painful area of loss. We mentioned Aristarchus of Samos and his heliocentric theory. His book outlining this theory on the sizes and distances of the sun and moon survives, but the book where he proposed the heliocentric model is lost. We only know of it because Archimedes mentions it. Did it contain mathematical proofs or observational data that would have made his case more compelling? We'll never know. The works of the great anatomist Herophilus are also gone. We know he wrote treatises on anatomy, the eyes, and midwifery, but they have vanished. His detailed descriptions of the nervous and circulatory systems could have advanced medicine by centuries if they had survived. Then there is the work of Hero of Alexandria. We have some of his writings on mechanics, but others are lost. Did his lost works contain more advanced machines? Did he have a theoretical understanding of steam power that went beyond the simple eolipile toy? We are left with a tantalizing glimpse of a technological world that might have been. Even the works we have are incomplete. We have the surviving works of Plato and Aristotle, but the library would have had all of their exoteric writings, the works they wrote for the general public, which were supposedly more polished and accessible than the esoteric lecture notes that make up the bulk of what we have today. Would these lost dialogues change our understanding of their philosophy? The loss is not just a matter of quantity. It's a matter of diversity. The surviving texts from the ancient world represent a tiny fraction of what was written. They are the works that were deemed important enough to be copied and recopied over the centuries, often by Christian monks who had their own biases about what was worth preserving. The Library of Alexandria would have held the unpopular texts, the weird ideas, the dissenting opinions, the scientific theories that went against the mainstream. We have lost the full texture and complexity of ancient thought. We are left with a highlight reel curated by the accidents of history. This leads to the most agonizing questions of all. What single lost text would have had the greatest impact on human history if it had survived? A cure for a disease described by Herophilus, a history that could have prevented a future conflict. A technological blueprint from Hero that could have kick-started an industrial revolution 1,000 years early. And how did the loss of this vast body of knowledge and the failed experiments, the minority reports, the dead-end theories give us a skewed and overly simplistic view of the ancient world as a place of steady, linear progress. Number 3, could the knowledge have survived somewhere else? The image of the library as a single, fragile repository of all knowledge is romantic, but it's not entirely accurate. Knowledge in the ancient world was not stored on a single hard drive. It was a distributed network, and the Library of Alexandria was the most important node, but not the only one. The idea of survival through copying and dispersal is key to understanding what was truly lost. First, the library itself was an active center of copying. One of its functions was to produce authoritative editions of major works and export them. And scholars and wealthy individuals from all over the Roman world would request copies of texts from the library. Alexandria was a major center of the book trade. Scribes in the city produced thousands of scrolls for sale and export. So, copies of many of the library's most important texts would have been disseminated throughout the Mediterranean. This is one of the main reasons we have the works of figures like Plato, Aristotle, and Euclid today. Their works were copied and studied in so many other places in Athens, Rome, Pergamon, and that the loss of the Alexandrian copies was not a fatal blow. Next second, there were other major libraries. The rival library at Pergamon was vast. Though it was eventually absorbed by Alexandria, Mark Antony supposedly gave its 200,000 scrolls to Cleopatra as a gift. For a long time, it was a separate major collection. Libraries in Rome became increasingly important, and private collectors, like the one whose library was preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius at Herculaneum, held thousands of scrolls. Knowledge was not centralized in a way that made a single point of failure catastrophic for the most famous works. The most important route of transmission, however, went east. As the Western Roman Empire declined, the intellectual center of gravity shifted to the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, with its capital at Constantinople. Byzantine scholars were obsessed with preserving and compiling classical Greek knowledge. They created encyclopedias and anthologies that preserved fragments of many lost works. Much of what we know about the lost literature of antiquity comes from these Byzantine compilations. Simultaneously, an incredible translation movement was happening in the Islamic world. Starting in the 8th and 9th centuries CE in Baghdad, scholars in the House of Wisdom undertook a massive project to translate Greek scientific, medical, and philosophical texts into Arabic. They translated Aristotle, Ptolemy, Galen, and Euclid. For several centuries, the centers of science and medicine were in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, not in Western Europe. Many Greek texts that were lost in the original Greek survived only in these Arabic translations. When they were eventually retranslated from Arabic into Latin in the late Middle Ages, they helped fuel the European Renaissance. For example, much of the advanced work of the mathematician Diophantus of Alexandria survived through this Arabic channel. So much of the core scientific and philosophical knowledge of Alexandria did survive. It was copied, translated, and dispersed. The idea that the destruction of the library plunged Europe into a dark age is a vast oversimplification. The decline of the Western Roman Empire was a complex political and economic process, and the core Greek texts were still available, just not always in Latin. What was lost then was not the greatest hits. What was lost was everything else. The second-tier poets, the obscure historians, the alternative scientific theories, the multiple variant editions of famous works, the plays that were not considered classics, the student lecture notes. This is the material that was likely not copied as often. It was the vast body of regular knowledge that formed the context for the great masterpieces. We have the peaks of the mountain range, but we have lost the rest of the landscape. This raises some critical questions. How many texts that we consider lost are actually sitting untranslated in an obscure Arabic or Syriac manuscript in some uncatalogued monastery library? Did Byzantine or Islamic scholars have access to texts from Alexandria that have since been lost, even in their translated forms? And is it possible that some scrolls were privately saved from the destruction of the Serapeum and survived in private collections in Egypt for centuries, only to be lost to the decay of time, never having been copied? The story of survival is as complex and uncertain as the story of destruction. Number 2. Did its loss cause the Dark Ages? It's a powerful and popular idea. The Library of Alexandria, a beacon of light, knowledge, and reason, is extinguished, and as a direct result, Europe plunges into 1,000 years of darkness, superstition, and ignorance. And Carl Sagan famously popularized this view in his series, Cosmos, lamenting that the scientific knowledge of the library was lost and the great enterprise of humanity was arrested for a millennium. This narrative is emotionally compelling, but it's bad history. the fall of the library did not cause the Dark Ages. First, as we've discussed, the decline of the library was a long, slow process that took place over centuries. It was a symptom of a larger civilizational decline, not the cause of it. The political instability, civil wars, and economic troubles that weakened the library were the same forces that were weakening the Roman Empire itself. The library faded as the world that supported it faded. Second, the Dark Ages is a problematic term that is mostly applied to Western Europe after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE. This collapse was a result of complex factors: political overreach, economic crisis, disease, climate change, and the so-called barbarian invasions. It had very little to do with the availability of books in a city in Egypt. The infrastructure for education and scholarship in the West crumbled because the state that supported it crumbled. People were more concerned with survival than with studying Greek philosophy. Third, knowledge was not lost to the world, only to Western Europe. As we saw, the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire continued to be a center of Greek scholarship. The Islamic world entered its golden age, making huge advances in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and optics, building directly on the Greek foundations laid in Alexandria. The light of learning didn't go out, it just moved. The term Dark Ages is a very Eurocentric way of looking at a period when other parts of the world were flourishing intellectually. Fourth, much of the key knowledge was never truly lost, just temporarily misplaced from the Latin West. The core texts of Aristotle and Ptolemy, for example, were preserved in Arabic and then reintroduced to Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, sparking the intellectual revival of the High Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The darkness was not a complete absence of knowledge, but a loss of connection to the main body of classical learning. What the loss of the library did represent was the end of a particular kind of intellectual institution. The Mouseion was a state-funded, centralized, secular research institute, nothing like it would exist again in the West for over 1,000 years. The model for learning in medieval Europe was the monastery, where knowledge was preserved, but the primary goal was theological, not open-ended scientific inquiry. The aggressive, competitive, and sometimes heretical spirit of Alexandrian research was replaced by a more conservative, scholastic tradition. So, the loss of the library was a tragedy, not because it single-handedly caused the Dark Ages, but because it was the most visible casualty of the end of the classical world. It was the death of a certain kind of intellectual optimism, the belief that all knowledge could be gathered and understood. This spirit would not be fully rekindled until the Enlightenment. The connection is not one of simple cause and effect, but one of shared fate. The library and the classical world that created it rose and fell together. This leaves us to ponder some counterfactuals. If the Roman Empire had remained stable and had continued to fund the Mouseion, what might have happened? Could a scientific revolution have occurred 1,000 years earlier? If the Serapeum had not been destroyed, could it have served as a bridge between classical pagan learning and Christian scholarship, preventing the schism between faith and reason that defines so much of Western history? Was the end of the library an inevitable consequence of the end of the ancient world, or was it a tragic mistake that set humanity back in ways we can only begin to imagine? Number one, is the library truly gone? The buildings are gone, the scrolls are dust, the scholars are long dead. In a literal sense, the lost Library of Alexandria is gone forever. But an idea is harder to kill than a building. The idea of the Library of Alexandria, the dream of a universal collection of all human knowledge, accessible to all who seek it, is more alive today than it ever was in the time of the Ptolemies. Its legacy is not in ruins, but in the very structure of our modern world. Every time you walk into a public library, you are walking into a descendant of Alexandria. The idea of a publicly accessible collection of knowledge, organized by subject, is a direct intellectual heir to the work done at the Mouseion and the Serapeum. Every research university where scholars are given the freedom and resources to pursue new knowledge is a modern Mouseion. The concept of a community of scholars supported by society to advance understanding is the Alexandrian model. The spirit of the Punakes Callimachus' great catalog lives on in every database, every search engine, every bibliography. The challenge he faced, how to organize a massive, overwhelming amount of information to make it useful, is the central challenge of our digital age. Google, Wikipedia, and the countless online archives are all attempts to solve the same problem that Callimachus tackled with scrolls and ink. They are attempts to create a map of knowledge. The most powerful modern incarnation of the Alexandrian dream is, of course, the internet. For the first time since Alexandria, We have a tool that could plausibly hold all the world's knowledge. The ambition to digitize every book, archive every web page, and record every piece of data is a modern echo of the Ptolemies' desire to collect every scroll. Projects like Google Books and the Internet Archive are explicitly Alexandrian in their scope and ambition. We are, in a very real sense, attempting to rebuild the library, not with papyrus, but with servers and fiber optic cables. This new library is larger and more accessible than the Ptolemies could have ever imagined. Anyone with a connection can access more information than was contained in all the ancient libraries combined. But this new library also faces its own dangers. Instead of fire and mobs, our knowledge is threatened by bit rot, link rot, and data degradation. Instead of a single point of failure, we have a distributed system that is vulnerable to misinformation, censorship, and the whims of the private corporations that control the servers. The challenge is no longer just collecting the information, but verifying it, preserving it, and ensuring it remains accessible to everyone, not just those who can pay. In 2002, a new library, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, was opened in Alexandria, near the site of the old one. It's a stunning piece of modern architecture and a major cultural and academic center. But it's also a monument to what was lost. It is an act of hope and a recognition that the dream never died. It is a statement that the work of gathering and sharing knowledge is a fundamental human endeavor. The Library of Alexandria is not just a historical place, it's a myth, a warning, and an inspiration. It's a warning about how easily knowledge can be lost to war, neglect, and intolerance. But it's also an inspiration, a testament to the enduring human desire to know, to understand, and to collect the scattered fragments of our genius into a single, shared story. The original library is gone, but the quest it represents is, and always will be, with us. This leaves us with the ultimate questions, ones that shape our future. In our attempt to build a new universal library online, are we creating a more robust and democratic system, or are we creating a more fragile one, dependent on electricity and corporate goodwill? What is our modern equivalent of the Pinakas? How do we sort truth from falsehood in an ocean of information without a Callimachus to guide us? And finally, what will future generations say was the great lost library of our time, the knowledge we are failing to preserve right now, the voices we are not recording, the data that is vanishing from our own aging digital shelves?